Greetings, fellow history lovers. Welcome to the new episode of History of Revolution podcast series, which we examine and unfold critical turning points that forged new paths in human history in chronological order. It's really great to have you with us again. What if the history of the United States isn't, a story of brilliant presidents, visionary inventors, and courageous generals, but like a 250-year, mostly hidden war over who actually gets the profits?
Yeah, that is a profound question, and it completely upends the way most of us were taught to look at the past, right? I mean, we are so accustomed to the whole great man theory of history.
Right, where a few exceptional individuals just drive all human progress.
Exactly, and the rest of the population just acts as, like, the background scenery.
Yeah, just extras in the movie. Well, for today's deep dive, we are looking at a massive stack of articles, essays, and historical analyses curated from the website In Defense of Marxism.
Right, which is quite the collection.
It is. The goal today is to take these highly specific, deeply analytical sources, written by authors like John Peterson, Alan Woods, Tom Trottier, and others, and translate their perspective for you, the listener.
Making it accessible.
Exactly. We're going to explore how these writers view the entire span of United States history, not as a neat timeline of presidential successions, but as a continuous, intense, and often violent class struggle.
But, before we dive into the timeline, it is critical to establish the ground rules for our discussion today.
Yeah, that's really important.
The source material we are working with is explicitly Marxist. It is inherently highly critical of the capitalist system.
Right.
So our job as your guides today is to impartially report on these arguments and break them down so they make sense. We are not here to take sides, to endorse a specific political party, or to tell you which economic system is the correct one.
No, absolutely not. Our goal is strictly educational.
Exactly. We are exploring a specific analytical framework so that you can understand precisely how Marxists interpret the history and development of the United States. We're just looking at the lens itself to see how the historical landscape changes when you view it through that specific optic.
And putting on those Marxist glasses reveals a staggering big picture right from the start.
It really does.
The authors present a core modern thesis to anchor their historical analysis. Today, the United States has a workforce of roughly 130 million people.
That's a huge number.
Right. And these workers are incredibly productive. They utilize advanced technology, highly complex supply chains, specialized skills. Yet the authors argue that these 130 million workers receive only a minuscule fraction of the immense wealth they generate every single day.
Yeah, and the vast majority of the value created by their labor flows upward, according to this view. It accumulates in the hands of the capitalist class, the people who own the corporations, the banks, the infrastructure.
Which is a stark contrast to how we normally view wealth creation.
Definitely. And the authors draw a direct causal line between that modern economic reality and the way history is taught in American schools.
Right, like there's a reason for it.
Exactly. Their thesis is that there's a deliberate systemic reason U.S. workers are not educated about their own history of rebellion.
Because if they knew...
Yeah, the argument is that if the American working class fully understood its true historical power, if they were intimately familiar with the rich domestic history of massive strikes, armed uprisings, and radical solidarity movements, they might realize they have the leverage to engage in open class struggle today.
And demand a larger share of that wealth.
Precisely.
So the implication is that history is essentially treated as a weapon, or at least like a tool of pacification.
Yeah, a way to keep things quiet.
Right. The ruling class conceals the revolutionary past because an awareness of past power is a mortal threat to the current economic system.
That's the core argument, yeah.
Yeah. To really grasp that concept, we have to understand the specific tool the authors use to analyze history. They rely on something called historical materialism.
Which is a heavy term.
It is. So I want to make sure we define this clearly for anyone who isn't steeped in political theory. How do these sources define historical materialism in a way that applies to the real world?
Well, to put it simply, historical materialism is the idea that the foundation of all human history is economics and resource distribution.
Okay, so follow the money, basically.
Pretty much. It argues that the way a society organizes its economy, Who owns the land, who owns the tools, who does the physical labor, and who gets to keep the surplus determines everything else in that society.
Everything, like culture and politics.
Yeah, everything. It dictates the laws, the political system, the dominant culture, and even the religious institutions.
Oh, wow.
So when a Marxist looks at a historical event, they don't look first at the ideals or the speeches of the leaders.
Right, they ignore the rhetoric.
Exactly. They look at the material conditions. They ask which social class is benefiting from this event and which social class is being exploited to make it happen.
So instead of looking at the Declaration of Independence just as a beautiful philosophical document about human rights, they look at the economic motivations of the men who signed it.
Yeah, and the economic status of the people who actually had to fight the war to make it a reality.
Which takes us directly to the foundations of the country. The authors analyze the American Revolution, spanning from 1775 to 1783.
Right, the classic origin story.
But they don't frame it just as a noble fight for democratic independence.
Yeah.
They frame it as the first successful colonial revolt against the most powerful imperialist force on the planet, driven by very specific economic necessities.
Yeah, author John Peterson's analysis of the Revolutionary War highlights a massive contradiction in the traditional narrative.
What's contradiction?
Well, the war was nominally led by what he calls self-styled aristocrats.
Okay, meaning who?
These were figures like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Hancock men who were incredibly wealthy landowners, slave owners, and merchant capitalists.
Right, the guys on the money.
Exactly. But these men were not the ones forming the rank and file of the Continental Army. They weren't the ones freezing at Valley Forge or dying in the mud at Saratoga.
Right, they were officers or politicians.
Yeah. The actual kinetic energy of the revolution, the physical blood and sacrifice, was provided by the lower classes.
So small tenant farmers, urban craftsmen, indentured servants.
Freedmen, enslaved people who were promised freedom, and Native Americans.
I want to push back on this a bit, or at least ask for clarification. We are taught that the Founding Fathers rebelled because of taxation without representation, because of an infringement on their liberties.
Right, the classic textbook reason.
Are the Marxist sources saying those ideals were just a smokescreen?
They aren't saying the ideals were entirely fabricated, no. But they argue that the ideals were secondary to the material reality.
Okay, so the economics came first.
Always. We have to define the economic system the British Empire was imposing on the colonies. It was called imperial mercantilism.
Mercantilism, right?
Yeah. Mercantilism is an economic system where the mother country tightly controls trade to extract maximum wealth.
Just a one-way street of resources.
Exactly. The British viewed the American colonies solely as a source of cheap raw materials, timber, tobacco, cotton, and as a captive market that was legally forced to buy finished manufactured goods only from Britain.
Wow, so they couldn't even make their own stuff legally.
No, the British explicitly banned the colonies from developing their own robust manufacturing base or trading freely with France or Spain.
So the colonial elites, this rising class of American capitalists and plantation owners, were hitting an economic ceiling.
A very hard ceiling.
They were building wealth, but they were shackled by British laws that prevented them from expanding their own industries and controlling their own trade routes.
Precisely. In Marxist terminology, the colonial elites represented the emerging American bourgeoisie.
The bourgeoisie.
Yeah, which is the class of people who own the means of production, the large farms, the merchant ships, the early workshops, and who employ the labor of others to generate profit.
Right, the owners.
The British mercantilist system had become a fetter, a chain, restricting the growth of American capitalism. The American bourgeoisie needed to break that chain to maximize their own wealth and power.
But there is a glaring logistical problem for these wealthy elites.
Right.
They have the economic grievances, but they don't have the sheer numbers to fight the British Army and the Royal Navy. A few hundred wealthy merchants in Boston and plantation owners in Virginia cannot defeat the British Empire alone.
Which is exactly why they had to draft documents like the Declaration of Independence.
Wait, really? The document itself was a recruitment tool.
Yeah, the Marxist analysis suggests that the elite class had to mobilize the working masses of the time. To get a poor farmer in Massachusetts to leave his family and risk his life picking up a musket, the elites couldn't just say, fight for us so we can trade our tobacco with France without paying a tax to King George.
Yeah, that's not exactly an inspiring battle cry.
Right. They had to promise something universal. They had to promise life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They had to frame a war for bourgeois economic liberation as a universal crusade for human freedom.
And the masses bought into it. They fought, they suffered, and they eventually defeated the British.
He did.
But the sources point out that once the British surrendered at Yorktown and the dust settled, those self-styled aristocrats suddenly faced a terrifying new problem.
A very big problem.
The working masses, having just successfully overthrown a monarch using violence, started taking those promises of liberty, equality, and the pursuit of happiness very literally. They wanted their share of the victory.
This brings the sources to a hyper-focus on an event that often gets glossed over in high school history. Shays' Rebellion.
Yeah, Shays' Rebellion.
This is a perfect case study for the Marxist Framework. Shays' Rebellion took place in Massachusetts in 1786, just a few years after the Revolutionary War ended. To understand why it happened, we have to look at the material conditions of the people who fought the war.
Let's paint that picture. You have thousands of poor farmers in western Massachusetts.
Right.
Many of them are Revolutionary War veterans. They had left their farms to fight the British. The Continental Congress couldn't afford to pay them in gold or silver, so they were paid in paper currency continental dollars.
Which rapidly became completely worthless due to hyperinflation.
Exactly. While these farmers were away fighting or returning home with worthless paper money, their farms had fallen into disrepair.
Yeah, you can't farm while you're shooting redcoats.
Right. So to get by, they had to borrow money or buy supplies on credit from the wealthy merchant class in eastern Massachusetts, specifically Boston.
And now that the war is over, those wealthy Boston merchants, the very same elite class who helped lead the revolution, are demanding that these debts be repaid immediately.
And they are demanding repayment not in worthless paper money, but in hard currency, gold and silver.
Which the farmers simply do not have. They literally do not possess the material wealth to pay these debts.
It's a brutal situation.
It is, and because they couldn't pay, the merchant-controlled state government began aggressively raising taxes and using the court system to seize the farmers' land, their livestock, and sometimes throwing the farmers themselves into debtor's prison.
Oh, man.
From a Marxist perspective, this is raw, unadulterated class conflict. The farmers, who bled for the revolution, are being economically crushed by the bourgeoisie who profited from it.
But the farmers didn't just write angry letters. They organized.
They sure did.
Led by a veteran named Daniel Shays, thousands of these armed, desperate farmers banded together and marched on the courthouses in western Massachusetts.
They physically shut down the courts to prevent any more farm foreclosures or debt hearings from taking place.
They were essentially saying, if the system only exists to strip us of our property and give it to the rich, we're going to dismantle the system.
And the reaction from the elite class is the most revealing part of this event for Marxist historians.
They were terrified, right?
Absolutely terrified. The wealthy merchants of Boston saw an armed, organized rebellion of the poor directly threatening their wealth and their control of the state.
And the national government couldn't do anything to help them.
No, because they were operating under the weak Articles of Confederation. They had no standing army and no real power to crush this kind of domestic uprising.
So what did the merchants do?
The Boston merchants literally had to pool their own private money to hire a mercenary militia to march west and forcefully crush Shays' Rebellion.
That is wild. So the wealthy elites realize they're sitting on a powder keg. They just used the masses to fight the British, and now the masses are turning those guns on them.
Exactly.
The sources argue that this sheer terror of the working class is what directly catalyzed the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia.
That is the core argument, yeah. Through this lens, the drafting of the U.S. Constitution wasn't just a philosophical exercise by flawless democratic visionaries seeking to build a perfect republic.
What was it then?
It was a crisis management operation by a highly class-conscious group of property owners.
Wow.
They needed to scrap the Articles of Confederation and build a strong, centralized federal state. They needed a government with the power to raise a national army, levy federal taxes, and explicitly protect the property rights of the wealthy minority against the democratic demands of the poor majority.
That completely flips the traditional narrative.
It really does.
We are taught the Constitution was designed with checks and balances to prevent the tyranny of a king or a dictator. The Marxist sources are arguing it was designed to prevent the tyranny of the poor, to ensure that the stagehands could never successfully demand a larger share of the ticket sales from the theater owners.
It is a stark shift in perspective. The sources view the Constitution as a legal fortress built to protect bourgeois property rights.
And this analytical framework becomes even more stark when the authors move the timeline forward to 1861 and the outbreak of the American Civil War.
Right, the next massive conflict.
In standard history textbooks, the Civil War is primarily taught as a tragic moral conflict over the horrific institution of slavery, combined with a dense constitutional crisis over states' rights and federal authority.
Sure.
But the Marxist writers we are analyzing, they classify the Civil War as the Second American Revolution.
Yes.
I need you to break this down for me. Why call a civil war between two halves of the same country a revolution?
To understand this, we have to revisit how historical materialism defines the word revolution.
Okay, because normally it just means overthrowing the government.
Right. In mainstream political discourse, a revolution just means a violent overthrow of a government, a change in leadership. But in Marxist theory, a revolution is something much deeper.
How so?
A revolution is the definitive transfer of power from one social class to another, resulting in a fundamental, permanent transformation of the economic mode of production.
So it's not just swapping out the people in charge, it's changing the entire economic engine of the society.
Exactly. By the mid-19th century, the United States was not a unified economy. It was effectively two entirely different, competing economic systems sharing a single expanding border.
The North and the South.
Right. In the North, you had a rapidly developing industrial capitalist economy. It was characterized by factories, railroads, banks, and, crucially, wage labor.
Where capitalists owned the factories and hired workers who were legally free to sell their labor for an hourly wage.
Yes. And in the South, you had an agrarian economy based entirely on the brutal, violent exploitation of chattel slavery.
A completely different world.
Completely. The Southern plantation owners, the Slavocracy, did not employ wage laborers. They legally owned human beings as property to produce cash crops, primarily cotton, for the global market.
The sources argue that these two economic systems were fundamentally incompatible, right?
Yes, they could not share the same continent indefinitely. And the conflict wasn't just geographical, it was political. Both the northern capitalists and the southern slave owners were locked in a fierce battle for control of the federal government.
Fighting over the Western territories.
Exactly. Would new states be incorporated as free states with wage labor or slave states? They were fighting over economic policies like tariffs, too.
How did tariffs play into it?
Well, the northern industrialists wanted high tariffs to protect their nascent factories from cheap British imports. The southern slave owners wanted low tariffs so they could cheaply import manufactured goods from Europe and export their cotton without retaliatory taxes.
It's an economic deadlock. And the authors argue that the southern slave-owning class was acting as a massive roadblock to the overall development of capitalism in North America.
That is the crucial point. For industrial capitalism to thrive and expand, it requires two fundamental things. First, it requires a mobile, free workforce of wage laborers who can move to where the factories are and compete for jobs, which drives down wages for the factory owners.
And the second thing?
Second, capitalism requires a massive, unified national market of consumers who earn wages and can buy the goods the factories produce.
And the slave system explicitly prevented both of those things.
Yes. Enslaved people were not mobile, and because they were not paid wages, they could not participate in the consumer economy. They couldn't buy the shoes, the clothes, or the tools manufactured in the North.
So the existence of the slave economy in the South was essentially choking the growth potential of the northern capitalist economy.
Exactly. The northern capitalist class, which finds its political representation in Abraham Lincoln and the newly formed Republican Party, eventually realizes they cannot compromise with this system anymore.
They have to wage a revolutionary war to break the political and economic power of the southern Slavocracy.
And this brings us to the profound economic mechanism of the Civil War. The sources emphasize that the defeat of the South wasn't just a military victory, it was an unprecedented economic upheaval.
Right.
The authors point out that the Civil War expropriated billions of dollars of property in slaves.
I really want to pause and dig into that concept. Expropriation. It's a massive concept in Marxist theory. Let me try a modern analogy here to make the sheer scale of this relatable to a contemporary listener.
Go for it.
Imagine if, tomorrow, the federal government suddenly declared that the entire global fossil fuel industry, every offshore oil rig, every mile of pipeline, every coal mine, every drop of crude oil held in reserve, was no longer legally recognized as private property.
Wow. Okay.
Imagine if all of that wealth, trillions of dollars resting on the balance sheets of massive corporations and sovereign wealth funds, was simply wiped out overnight by executive decree.
That would be.
The economic shockwave would be completely unimaginable. The stock market would collapse. Global power dynamics would instantly shift. It would be a hostile asset seizure on a planetary scale.
That is an incredibly apt analogy for understanding the economic mechanics of the Civil War,
Right.
the Emancipation Proclamation, and the subsequent total military defeat of the Confederacy represented the largest uncompensated expropriation of private wealth in world history up to that point.
It's just staggering to think about it in those terms.
It is. The Marxist authors are emphasizing a cold, hard fact. Enslaved human beings were legally categorized as property. They were the foundational assets, the absolute bedrock of the Southern economy.
Freeing them was a glorious moral imperative, an overdue victory for human dignity. But from a structural Marxist perspective, emancipating the slaves was the necessary forceful destruction of an antiquated economic model.
Yeah, the North had to physically smash the Southern economic engine, wipe out its foundational assets to secure the absolute unquestioned dominance of industrial capitalism across the entire continent.
This is why they call it the Second American Revolution.
Exactly. The Civil War violently replaced the slave-owning class with the industrial capitalist class as the undisputed rulers of the American political and economic system.
And the human lives that were rightly and thankfully emancipated were the assets contested in a total war between two incompatible modes of production.
It is a very structural, objective way to look at a deeply emotional and human tragedy.
But it perfectly explains the sheer scale, the totality, and the uncompromising violence of the conflict.
It really does.
And that structural victory fundamentally changed the trajectory of the country. Once the dust settled on the Civil War and the Slavocracy was destroyed, the roadblock to capitalism was gone.
Completely gone.
The Industrial Revolution didn't just walk, it sprinted across the United States. In the decades following the Civil War, we see the Gilded Age. Railroads span the continent, massive steel mills and coal mines are built, and cities explode in size.
And this rapid, relentless industrialization created something entirely new in America on a massive scale. A vast urban working class.
We're talking about millions of people, many of them newly arrived, immigrants or farmers pushed off their land, who owned absolutely no property, no tools, no farms.
Right, they had nothing to survive on except selling their physical labor power by the hour.
Which sets the stage for the next phase of our historical analysis. When you have a massive, highly concentrated working class, packed into crowded urban slums, and being pushed to their absolute physical limits in these new, incredibly dangerous factories and mines.
It is only a matter of time before they start organizing for their own survival.
Exactly. This is where the authors transition to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a period characterized by robber barons, immense, unprecedented wealth inequality, and brutal, often lethal working conditions.
The sources highlight several key figures and movements from this era, focusing on the true origins of the American left. Carl Boleyn's appraisal of Daniel De Leon and the founding of the Socialist Labor Party, or SLP, is where they start.
De Leon is a fascinating, complex historical figure.
He really is.
He was a university professor who became a rigid, uncompromising Marxist theoretician in the late 1800s. He looked at the early trade unions, which were just fighting for a few extra cents an hour, and argued that this wasn't enough.
Right. He believed a working class needed a dedicated political party to fight not just for better wages, but for total democratic control of the state and the entire economy.
So he was kind of a visionary in that sense.
De Leon's contribution was significant because he introduced rigorous Marxist theory to the American labor movement. However, the sources also critique his methods.
Why? What did he do wrong?
They suggest that while his ideas seeded the ground, his movement ultimately struggled because of how he operated. He is described as being too sectarian.
Let's define sectarian in this context, because it's a word that gets thrown around a lot in radical politics.
Yeah.
What does it mean for a socialist leader to be sectarian?
In political organizing, being sectarian means focusing so narrowly on your specific doctrinal purity and theoretical correctness that you isolate yourself from the broader, messy reality of the actual working class.
Okay, so like being a purist to a fault.
Exactly. A sectarian might refuse to support a major strike by thousands of workers simply because the union leading the strike doesn't agree with every single point of their specific Marxist program.
Oh.
They prioritize being theoretically right over building actual mass solidarity. The authors argue that de Leon sometimes alienated potential allies in the broader labor movement because of this rigidity, demanding ideological perfection before engaging in joint struggles.
So he was a brilliant theorist, but maybe not the most practical coalition builder on the factory floor.
Yeah, that's a fair assessment.
But his ideas permeated the culture. The outline then shifts us forward from de Leon's era to a very specific cinematic moment in history, January 1917.
This is a great story.
Tom Trottier's article outlines a meeting that took place in New York City to organize the left-wing faction of the Socialist Party of America.
And this is where we see an incredible intersection of global history. The article notes that there were approximately 20 people gathered in the room in New York for this meeting.
Okay.
And one of those 20 people was Leon Trotsky.
That detail is just astounding. Leon Trotsky, one of the central architects of the Russian Revolution, the future founder of the Red Army, sitting in a smoky room in the Bronx with a handful of American socialists.
It sounds like historical fan fiction, but it is entirely real.
It really does.
He lived in New York briefly in early 1917. He was writing for a Russian-language socialist newspaper called Novy Mir, debating American leftists about World War I and imperialism right before the events of March 1917, called him back to Russia to co-lead the first successful workers' revolution alongside Vladimir Lenin.
It highlights the deeply international nature of the socialist movement at the time. These ideas were flowing constantly across borders.
They were, but we need to look at the why of these early American movements. Why were these 20 people meeting in New York? Why form the Socialist Labor Party or the Socialist Party of America?
Right.
The Marxist authors emphasize that it wasn't just a book club discussing abstract European theory. These movements formed out of absolute life or death necessity. They were organizing to demand basic concessions from the capitalist class that were completely absent at the time.
They're fighting for the 8-hour workday so people didn't have to work 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. They were fighting for the fundamental legal right to form a union and go on strike without being physically attacked, beaten, or shot by private Pinkerton detective agencies or state militias called in by the factory owners.
It was a brutal time.
They were fighting against the horrific reality of child labor, fighting for basic safety regulations in factories where people were routinely maimed or killed by unguarded machinery. The things we take for granted today as normal, baseline parts of a modern job, were considered wildly radical, dangerous communist demands 100 years ago.
Exactly. The authors note that the left wing of the Socialist Party, the faction that gathered at that 1917 meeting with Trotsky, eventually evolved.
Right.
Inspired by the success of the Russian Revolution later that year, they eventually formed the Communist Party USA, the CPUSA. A key strategy for these early groups was publishing a regular Marxist newspaper.
Like Trotsky was doing.
Yeah. The authors explain that a revolutionary paper serves as a collective organizer. It provides a unified, class-based analysis of current events, connects isolated strikes happening in different cities, and offers a common program for action.
To bring everyone onto the same page?
Literally, yeah. They were trying to build what Marxists call a vanguard, a highly dedicated, theoretically trained layer of leadership that could guide the broader working class when spontaneous, chaotic struggles inevitably broke out.
Okay, I have to step in here and ask the obvious question. I'm putting myself in the shoes of the listener.
Sure.
If these early movements were fighting for such clear, necessary goals, like basic human dignity and safety, and if they had such momentum, passion, and intellectual heavyweights like Trotsky passing through and influencing them, why didn't socialism take hold in America the way it did in Russia? Why didn't we see a 1917-style revolution in New York or Chicago or Detroit?
That is perhaps the central question for any Marxist historian analyzing the United States.
I imagine so.
And the authors, like Trottier in his analysis of the early CPUSA and the Socialist Party, provide a nuanced answer. They point to a complex combination of objective conditions and subjective mistakes. We have to look at both.
Let's start with the objective conditions. What was happening in the American economy that prevented a revolution?
Objectively, American capitalism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was still in a phase of massive expansion.
It was booming.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It had vast, untapped natural resources, an expanding western frontier, and an incredible ability to absorb massive waves of immigration to constantly replenish the labor pool. Because the U.S. economy was becoming an absolute global juggernaut, the capitalist class generated staggering amounts of surplus wealth.
So they had money to spare.
Exactly. They were wealthy enough to occasionally grant concessions to prevent a total explosion. They could offer slightly higher wages or gooder conditions to a privileged upper layer of skilled workers.
So because the engine was running so hot and generating so much money, the owners could afford to ease the pressure just enough.
Right.
They could buy off a section of the working class, creating a labor aristocracy that felt invested in the capitalist system, which blunted the revolutionary edge of the movement.
Exactly. But the authors do not place all the blame on the strength of American capitalism. They also point to critical subjective mistakes made by the socialist leadership themselves.
This ties back to the critique of De Leon's sectarianism.
Yes. The sources analyze how leaders sometimes fail to connect their grand Marxist theories to the organic, everyday, immediate struggles of the American worker.
Can you give a tangible example of what a subjective mistake looks like in this context?
A subjective mistake would be a Socialist Party leadership deciding to spend all their resources publishing lengthy theoretical journals debating the intricacies of the Russian Revolution while completely ignoring a massive spontaneous strike by textile workers happening right in their own city because the strike wasn't officially sanctioned by their party.
Missing the forest for the trees.
Right. Or attempting to force foreign organizational models onto the American working class without adapting to the specific cultural and historical realities of the U.S.
That makes sense.
The Marxist authors argue that a successful revolution requires two things to align perfectly: the right objective conditions, a deep, systemic crisis that paralyzes the capitalist system.
And the subjective factor.
Exactly. The right subjective factor, a prepared, deeply rooted, and trusted leadership capable of guiding the masses to take power. In the early 20th century U.S., those two elements never perfectly aligned.
That makes perfect sense. The environment wasn't quite explosive enough to shatter the system, and the revolutionary sparks weren't always placed in the most effective spots.
Right.
However, while those early socialist parties struggled to capture state power during the boom times, the objective conditions were about to change in a way no one could have predicted. Because the Roaring '20s were about to slam into a concrete wall.
The Great Depression.
Yeah, exactly. The economic crash of the late 1920s fundamentally broke the promise of American capitalism for millions of people overnight. And that immense, terrifying suffering set the stage for explosive, direct, militant labor action in the 1930s. By the way, if you liked and interested to the topics in the video so far, please don't forget to like, share, and comment. Also, we'd be appreciated if you subscribe to the channel to be informed about new episodes. It's also really important for us to continue this series.
The 1930s represent a profound shift in the American class struggle. We move from the birth of theoretical political parties to an era of massive, radical, direct action in the streets.
Things got real very quickly.
They did. When the Great Depression hit, the objective conditions the Marxists talk about materialized with brutal force. Unemployment skyrocketed to 25%. Wages for those who still had jobs plummeted.
People were starving in cities while farmers were destroying crops because they couldn't sell them.
Desperation was everywhere. The sources bring us to a critical, violent inflection point in this era. The 1934 Minneapolis Teamster strike, analyzed deeply in an article by David May.
The outline notes that this specific strike was led by the Trotskyists of the Communist League of America, which was a forerunner to the Socialist Workers' Party. Now, when most people today hear strike, they picture a few dozen people walking in a circle holding signs on a sidewalk while the business stays open.
Yeah, that's the modern image.
The 1934 Minneapolis strike was nothing like that. It was a literal war for control of the city streets.
It was a defining battle for the American labor movement. But to understand why it was so effective and so threatening to the ruling class, we need to break down how strikes actually work as a weapon of class struggle from a Marxist perspective.
Let's do that. What is the actual mechanism of a strike?
Well, a strike is not merely a protest, a parade, or a demonstration of anger. A strike is the deliberate, organized withholding of the one single element the capitalist class absolutely requires to generate profit: human labor power.
Right, because according to the Marxist theory of value, all new wealth is created by the application of human labor to raw materials.
Exactly. A capitalist can own the means of production. They can own a massive fleet of delivery trucks, a huge warehouse, millions of dollars in inventory. But without the workers to physically drive the trucks, load the boxes, and navigate the city, all of those assets are just dead capital. They produce zero profit.
So by going on strike, the workers are essentially pulling the plug on the capitalist machine.
They are demonstrating in real time that they, the workers, are the ones who actually make the city function, not the owners who sit in the offices.
And in Minneapolis in the summer of 1934, the truck drivers didn't just walk off the job, they aggressively shut the entire city down.
Minneapolis was a major distribution hub. When the Teamsters stopped delivering goods, nothing moved. Food, fuel, raw materials, it all ground to a halt.
And the bosses obviously didn't just surrender. They formed a powerful group called the Citizens Alliance, which is dedicated to breaking unions.
And when the bosses tried to bring in scabs replacement workers to drive the trucks and break the strike, the striking Teamsters physically stopped them.
They didn't just hold signs, they used highly organized tactics. They formed what were called flying pickets.
The flying pickets were brilliant.
Yeah. These were mobile groups of strikers in cars and trucks connected by a central headquarters with a telephone switchboard. If the bosses tried to sneak a truck out of a warehouse anywhere in the city, the flying pickets would rush to that location in minutes and physically blockade the truck, sometimes pulling the scab drivers out of the cabs.
The authors detail how this strike was a decisive moment because it proved a critical theory in practice. Organized, militant, unapologetic action could force major, life-changing concessions from powerful employers.
But the state fought back hard.
They did. The capitalist class of Minneapolis, the local government, and the police department colluded to break the strike using extreme violence. This culminated in an event known as Bloody Friday.
Bloody Friday.
Yeah. The police, acting essentially as a private army for the Citizens Alliance, opened fire with shotguns into a crowd of unarmed strikers in the Market District, killing 2 workers and injuring dozens of others, shooting many of them in the back as they fled.
It was an attempt to terrorize the workers into submission.
But it had the exact opposite effect.
Right. The workers did not back down. The violence outraged the entire working class of the city. The Teamsters expanded the strike.
And crucially, they didn't just focus on the truck drivers.
Right, they broadened it.
The Trotskyist leadership reached out to the massive numbers of unemployed workers in the city, to sympathetic farmers in the surrounding areas, and to other unions. They built a broad, unified class alliance.
They demonstrated that if the working class is united, highly organized, and refuses to be intimidated by state violence, they possess a power far greater than the police force or the wealthy elite.
Eventually, the city and the bosses had to capitulate.
A huge victory.
It was. The Teamsters won union recognition, significant wage increases, and the right to organize inside workers, not just drivers. This victory in Minneapolis, along with similar militant strikes in Toledo and San Francisco that same year, broke the dam.
It paved the way for the massive, million-strong industrial unionization drives of the CIO that completely transformed the American workplace in the late 1930s.
Connecting this history to the bigger picture, John Peterson's article on the crisis of the 1930s makes a powerful point about how human consciousness changes.
Okay, how so?
He argues that during long periods of relative economic stability, people naturally tend to accept the dominant ideology of the society they live in. They absorb the cultural mantra that capitalism equals freedom and prosperity and socialism equals tyranny and poverty.
Right, it's just the water we swim in.
Exactly. This narrative is constantly reinforced by mainstream media, the education system, and political institutions.
But the critical extrapolation the authors make is that when a sudden, massive economic implosion happens, it violently reshapes how Americans view the system they live under.
Yes, the stark reality of suddenly not being able to feed your children, of being evicted from your home while millions of houses sit empty, completely shatters the illusion of the American dream.
Peterson writes that experience itself molds public opinion far faster and far more thoroughly than any mainstream media narrative or political speech ever could.
When people directly experience the brutality of artificial scarcity, experiencing grinding poverty in a country overflowing with agricultural and industrial wealth, their political consciousness leaps forward.
They suddenly become open to radical ideas, to socialist concepts of wealth redistribution and worker power that they would have completely ignored or even violently opposed just a decade earlier.
This raises an extremely important question for modern times, and it's a connection the sources constantly make.
Drawing a line to today.
Yeah. They draw a direct, unbroken line between the economic trauma of the 1930s and contemporary economic crises, like the 2008 financial crash, the severe disruptions of the COVID-19 pandemic, and ongoing crises of inflation and housing affordability.
The Marxist argument is that sudden, sharp changes in objective conditions, a massive stock market crash, waves of corporate layoffs, skyrocketing rent prices, act as a societal catalyst.
They wake the working class from its ideological slumber and force it to seek out new political and economic solutions, simply as a matter of raw survival.
So you have these intense, bloody, existential labor battles in the 1930s, where workers are fighting for economic survival. Through their militancy, they force the system to grant major concessions: the legal recognition of unions, the New Deal social programs, Social Security, the minimum wage.
Right.
A generation passes, the country goes through the massive mobilization of World War II, and then in the 1950s and 60s, the U.S. hits another period of massive, explosive social upheaval.
A huge one.
But this time, the primary focus of the unrest isn't just about factory wages and union contracts. It's about fundamental human rights, segregation, and systemic racism. How do the Marxist sources connect the economic class struggles of the 1930s to the massive civil rights upheavals that followed a generation later?
This brings us to the profound social transformations of the 1960s and 70s. As Tom Trotter's analysis outlines, this was a period of immense global and domestic turmoil.
You had the monumental civil rights movement fighting to dismantle the legal apartheid of Jim Crow segregation in the South.
You had massive, radicalizing anti-Vietnam War protests on college campuses and in the streets. You had the emergence of powerful liberation movements for women, the LGBT community, and indigenous peoples.
To a lot of people looking back at history, these seem like separate, parallel issues. You have the labor movement fighting for economic issues in the 30s, and then civil rights groups fighting against racism and discrimination in the 60s. They seem like different movements with different goals.
And that separation is exactly where the Marxist critique of mainstream anti-racism movements comes into play.
Oh, so?
The sources we are analyzing, specifically documents from the Workers' International League on the Black struggle and the Socialist Revolution, argue forcefully that fighting racial discrimination must be intrinsically, permanently combined with a united working class struggle against the capitalist economic system.
Okay.
From the Marxist perspective, racism and economic exploitation aren't separate issues. They are fundamentally the exact same issue, stemming from the same source.
Let's unpack this carefully because it's a major departure from how civil rights are usually taught.
Yeah.
How do these authors link racism and capitalism so inextricably? Why do they argue that you can't just fight racism on its own through legal reforms and education without touching the economy?
The Marxist analysis posits that racism is not simply a moral failing, a psychological prejudice, or a collection of bad ideas held by ignorant individuals.
Right.
They argue that systemic racism was historically constructed and is actively maintained by the capitalist class as a deliberate, necessary tool to divide the working class and maximize profits.
If we go all the way back to the colonial era and the origins of American slavery, racial ideologies and pseudosciences were intentionally developed to justify the extreme, violent economic exploitation of African labor.
Exactly. You have to invent a philosophy that says certain people are less than human to justify treating them as farm equipment.
That's a dark way to put it, but it's accurate to the history.
And in the modern post-slavery era, the authors argue that the ruling class continues to intentionally stoke racial divisions.
How do they do that today?
They do this by paying Black workers less than white workers, by structurally pushing different ethnic groups to compete against each other for scarce, low-paying jobs, and by legally enforcing segregated, underfunded housing and schools.
And the economic purpose of this racism is to prevent the working class from ever uniting against their common exploiter.
Yes. The idea is that if the struggling white factory worker is busy blaming the Black worker or the immigrant worker for his low wages and his poor living conditions, he isn't looking up at the corporate boss who is actually setting the wages, busting the unions, and taking all the profits.
Racism is the ultimate divide and conquer strategy. It keeps labor cheap across the board because a divided workforce cannot negotiate effectively.
Precisely. Therefore, the Marxist authors conclude that you cannot fully, permanently eradicate racism without eradicating the economic system that materially benefits from it and constantly perpetuates it.
They argue that you simply cannot have capitalism without racism.
Which is why the sources focus so heavily and so favorably on the Black Panther Party, specifically analyzing them in John Peterson's pieces.
The Black Panthers are such a fascinating and often deeply misunderstood part of this history.
They really are.
Frequently, mainstream historical narratives just remember them for the aesthetics, the leather jackets, the berets, and the dramatic images of them carrying legally registered firearms.
But Peterson points out that they were a deeply ideological, sophisticated political organization.
Yeah.
As the Panthers evolved, visionary leaders like Fred Hampton in Chicago realized exactly what we are talking about right now: the intrinsic link between race and class. Hampton famously formed what he called the Rainbow Coalition.
The formation of the Rainbow Coalition is a masterclass in the kind of organizing the Marxist sources advocate for.
It really is. Hampton, a brilliant young Black Panther leader, brought together his own organization with the Young Lords, which was a radical Puerto Rican group.
But crucially, he also reached out to a group called the Young Patriots.
Yes, the Young Patriots.
And the Young Patriots were a gang of poor, working-class white youths from Appalachia who had migrated to the slums of uptown Chicago. They actually wore Confederate flags on their jackets as a symbol of their Southern rebel identity.
And Fred Hampton, a Black Panther, walked into a room with poor white kids wearing Confederate flags and organized them.
How exactly did he bridge that massive, seemingly impossible racial and cultural divide? What was the mechanism of that solidarity?
He bridged the divide by focusing relentlessly on shared material conditions.
Okay.
Hampton didn't start by lecturing them on racial sensitivity. He sat down with the Young Patriots and pointed out that they were suffering from the exact same economic exploitation as the Black community on the South Side.
He pointed out that they were both being gouged by identical slum landlords.
Yeah, they were both attending crumbling, underfunded schools. They were both denied adequate health care, and they were both being routinely harassed and brutalized by the exact same Chicago Police Department.
He convinced the Young Patriots to drop the Confederate flag by showing them who their real enemy was.
Hampton explicitly told the coalition, "We're not going to fight racism with racism. We're going to fight racism with solidarity. We're not going to fight capitalism with Black capitalism. We're going to fight capitalism with socialism."
What's fascinating here is that the Marxist authors view the Black Panthers, and particularly leaders like Fred Hampton, as reaching the highest level of revolutionary consciousness in that entire era.
Because they weren't just fighting for civil rights. They were actively organizing a unified, multiracial, working-class army to challenge the capitalist state.
And the state clearly recognized the severity of this threat. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, launched the illegal COINTELPRO program specifically to destroy the Panthers.
The sources argue the FBI didn't target the Panthers just because they were armed, but specifically because they were successfully bridging the racial divide and building that unified class struggle.
The brutal assassination of 21-year-old Fred Hampton by Chicago police while he slept in his bed is viewed through this analytical lens as the capitalist state violently eliminating a uniquely talented leader who is capable of uniting the working class. Hey, listener, do you have any other idea or question about this? Please write in comments so we can see and try to answer.
It is a chilling and tragic historical moment, and the sources draw very direct contemporary echoes from that era to our current moment.
How so?
Peterson's articles heavily reference modern movements, specifically the emergence of Black Lives Matter and the massive explosive protests in Ferguson, Missouri, following the police killing of Michael Brown.
Right.
The sources explicitly compare the modern scenes of heavily militarized police driving armored vehicles and firing tear gas at protesters in Ferguson to the state violence seen in the U.S. in the 1950s and 60s, or even to imperialist military occupations abroad.
The extrapolation the authors make here is that the fundamental economic contradictions that fueled the massive uprisings of the 1960s were never actually resolved.
No, they weren't.
The end of legal Jim Crow segregation was a massive historic victory, a completely necessary democratic step forward. But the Marxist authors argue that because the underlying capitalist economic system remained entirely intact, the material oppression of Black Americans simply mutated and took on new systemic forms.
Exactly. Instead of whites-only signs, you get mass incarceration, the privatization of prisons, systemic generational poverty, the militarization of local police forces, and the deliberate underfunding of public schools based on local property taxes.
Therefore, the Marxist conclusion is that modern anti-racist movements will inevitably hit a wall, and reforms will be rolled back, unless these movements broaden their scope to aggressively attack the foundational economic roots of inequality.
They argued that civil rights must be combined with a demand for economic rights, housing, healthcare, education, and jobs for all, which they believe is only possible under a socialist system.
So the radical energy of the 60s and 70s achieved deeply important democratic reforms, but it failed to fundamentally overthrow the economic system.
The capitalist class weathered the storm, adapted, and maintained control of the wealth.
And as we transition into the final phase of our historical journey, we look at what happened next. After the revolutionary wave of the 60s receded, there were various attempts to institutionalize working-class power within the political system. This brings us to the modern labor movement and the contemporary political crisis.
We jump forward a few decades to the mid-1990s. Tom Trottier's article examines a very specific, incredibly important, and unfortunately often forgotten chapter in modern political history.
The rise and rapid collapse of the U.S. Labor Party, which was founded in 1996.
Yes. This was a massive, serious attempt by an alliance of major trade unionists to finally break the stranglehold of the American two-party system.
The central argument behind founding the Labor Party was that both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are fundamentally inherently capitalist parties.
Right. They're both primarily funded by and ultimately serve the interests of massive corporations, Wall Street banks, and the billionaire class.
The union leaders involved felt that the working class needed a political party of their own, funded by workers, to represent their specific class interests.
But the U.S. Labor Party failed. It gained significant initial support and excitement from the rank-and-file union members, but then rapidly declined and essentially vanished in the late 90s and early 2000s.
Why did it fail so quickly?
The Marxist sources analyze why this incredibly promising initiative failed so completely. According to Trottier, the primary reason for failure was a lack of political courage from the leadership. The leaders of the Labor Party refused to actually run independent candidates in major elections.
Wait, why wouldn't a political party run candidates? That seems entirely counterproductive.
They were paralyzed by the fear of acting as a spoiler. They were terrified that if they ran a strong labor candidate, they would pull votes away from the Democratic Party and accidentally hand elections over to the more aggressively anti-union Republican Party.
Oh, the classic spoiler effect fear.
Exactly. Because they refused to challenge the Democrats at the ballot box, the Labor Party essentially reduced itself to a glorified lobbying group, just putting pressure on the Democrats from the outside rather than acting as a truly independent oppositional political force.
Trottier argues that modern Marxists must learn a critical lesson from this failure.
Yeah, he argues that a true working-class party must boldly assert its complete independence. It must present a clear, uncompromising socialist alternative to the capitalist status quo, rather than trying to gently reform capitalist parties from the inside.
Which the sources argue is impossible because those parties are fundamentally controlled by corporate money.
And this leads us directly to the modern contemporary political crisis.
Because the failure to build a mass, independent working-class party in the 90s left a massive political vacuum in the United States.
Yes, and as the internal contradictions of capitalism continued to sharpen, culminating in the devastating 2008 global financial crisis, the explosion of extreme wealth inequality where billionaires multiply while wages stagnate, and the rise of the precarious, low-wage gig economy, that political vacuum began to be filled.
Filled by a massive renewed interest in the concept of socialism, particularly among millennials and Gen Z.
And the ruling class absolutely noticed this shift in consciousness.
They sure did. This is where the sources bring us to a truly remarkable document published in 2018 by Donald Trump's White House, specifically by the Council of Economic Advisors. It was a formal government report, literally titled, "The Opportunity Costs of Socialism."
The mere fact that the White House felt politically compelled to issue a 70-page, supposedly scientific economic rebuttal to the concept of socialism shows that these ideas were gaining serious, measurable traction.
The White House was terrified.
They saw polling data showing that young people were looking at their crushing student debt, their lack of affordable health care, the reality that they would likely never be able to afford a home, and the looming catastrophe of climate change. And these young people were logically concluding that the capitalist system had entirely failed them.
Alan Woods, one of the premier Marxist theoreticians writing for the site, wrote a direct, blistering rebuttal to that White House document. He unpacks exactly why socialism is gaining ground again in the heart of the capitalist empire.
Woods points out that the White House document relied heavily on tired, old Cold War tropes. The government report tried to equate the modern desire for democratic socialism with the brutal, bureaucratic, totalitarian dictatorships of Maoist China or the Soviet Union under Stalin.
And Woods dismantles that comparison.
He argues that the modern youth turning towards socialism are absolutely not looking for a totalitarian dictatorship. They are looking for genuine, profound democratic control over the economy.
Woods points out the massive difference in material conditions.
Yeah, Russia in 1917 was a largely illiterate, peasant-based society devastated by war. It lacked the material wealth to build a prosperous socialist society, which led to scarcity and bureaucratic control.
The United States in the 21st century, however, is the wealthiest, most technologically advanced society in human history.
Exactly. Woods argues that the American youth want the vast, unimaginable wealth created by the working class to be rationally planned and used for free universal health care, fully funded education, green infrastructure, and social needs, rather than being squandered on corporate stock buybacks, Wall Street speculation, and billionaire space races.
In his book, Marxism in the USA, which Woods actually wrote years earlier during the George W. Bush administration, he pushes back incredibly hard against a very common misconception.
There is a pervasive idea, even on the political left, that the United States is just one giant, immovable, conservative, reactionary bloc, completely devoid of any real revolutionary potential.
Woods argues that this is historically illiterate. He insists that socialism is absolutely not a foreign importation. It is not some alien virus introduced to the American character from Europe.
He traces the organic, domestic roots of radicalism right back through the lineage we've discussed today. The revolutionary defiance of the colonial farmers against the British Empire, the uncompromising militancy of the abolitionists who fought to destroy slavery, the courage of the early socialists and the Wobblies.
The physical bravery of the militant Union strikers in the 1930s who faced down police bullets. The radical vision of the civil rights leaders and the Black Panthers.
Woods argues that the profound desire for equality and the willingness to violently fight against economic exploitation has deep, unshakable roots in American traditions.
If we tie all these historical threads together from 1776 to the present day, the sources present a very clear, overarching thesis. They argue that the United States, far from being immune to class struggle, is actually the single most decisive battleground on the planet.
Given America's immense, unparalleled military power, its global cultural hegemony, and most importantly, the massive size, high education level, and technological capacity of its working class, a successful socialist revolution in the U.S. would instantly, irrevocably transform the entire globe.
This brings us back to a profound quote from Leon Trotsky that was mentioned earlier in the text. Looking at the immense industrial capacity of America in the early 20th century, Trotsky called the United States the foundry in which the fate of man is to be forged.
A foundry.
Yeah, a foundry is where you melt down raw metal at extreme temperatures to cast it into something completely new, something stronger. I really want you to unpack that metaphor for me. What does that mean for the 130 million workers going to their jobs in America today?
It means that the objective material conditions required to build a post-scarcity, truly socialist society exist more profoundly and completely in the United States than anywhere else in human history.
We have everything we need.
Yeah. The U.S. has the logistical networks, the hyper-efficient supply chains, the incredible agricultural capacity, the advanced robotics and AI, and the highly skilled labor force required to provide a phenomenally high standard of living for every single person on Earth.
The only thing standing in the way of realizing that potential, according to the strict Marxist perspective, is the capitalist system of private ownership, which dictates that all this technology and wealth must be used primarily to generate profit for a tiny minority, rather than meeting the needs of humanity.
The Foundry metaphor suggests that the intense, unbearable heat of the American class struggle, the extreme daily contradictions between unimaginable billionaire wealth and grinding, precarious poverty, will eventually reach a boiling point and melt down the old capitalist system.
And the American working class are the blacksmiths who have the historical task of forging a new, democratic socialist society from the molten remains.
So the core argument of these sources is that the American working class literally holds the keys to human liberation, not just for themselves domestically, but globally.
Because if the heart of global capitalism, Wall Street, and the U.S. military apparatus stops beating, the entire global system fundamentally changes overnight.
That is a staggeringly large, heavy concept to digest.
It is, but it completely reframes the daily grind of modern lives. When you view history through this lens, Every Amazon warehouse worker trying to organize a union, every striking nurse demanding safer patient ratios, every barista walking off the job to protest low wages. They aren't just fighting an isolated battle for an extra dollar an hour.
They are actively participating in a continuous, unbroken, historical continuum of class struggle that stretches all the way back to the Minutemen at Lexington and Concord and the farmers in Shays' Rebellion.
This raises one final, crucial thought experiment for the listener to ponder as we conclude. We started this deep dive talking about the way history is traditionally taught in our schools, the bright spotlight constantly shining on the presidents, the generals, and the wealthy elites on the stage.
Right, the traditional great men of history theory that tells us progress only comes from the top down.
Now, imagine if the national curriculum was completely inverted. Imagine if the history of the United States was taught in every elementary and high school, primarily through the specific materialist lens we've explored today.
If students learned about labor strikes, worker uprisings, slave revolts, and the brutal dynamics of class conflict as the primary driving engines of all historical change.
How would that fundamentally alter the way modern citizens view their own political power today?
If you are taught from childhood that societal change only comes from a benevolent, enlightened leader signing a law or writing a proclamation, you are conditioned to passively wait for a savior to vote for.
But if you are taught that absolutely every single right you currently possess, the weekend, the 8-hour day, workplace safety, civil rights, was won by ordinary working-class people aggressively withholding their labor and violently fighting the system, how does that change your view of the future and your role in it?
It changes absolutely everything.
It tells you that the stagehands don't just work at the theater. They actually built the building, they generate all the revenue, and ultimately, if they unite, they have the power to stop the show and write a completely new play.
It is a profound, paradigm-altering shift in how we understand our own agency and our place in history.
I think we've covered a lot of ground today, and here's the solid place to finish the episode. Thank you for tuning in. Please don't forget to like, share, and comment. You can check the link in the description to listen to the full History of Revolution podcast playlist. We're grateful you're here. Take care until next time.